Okay, kia ora koutou, and welcome everyone to this session on internationalization with Professor Rob Rabel from Victoria University of Wellington. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Rob to this session. Rob is an old colleague and good friend, and he brings a wealth of knowledge on this area to this seminar today, and there's a lot we can learn from Rob. Rob is a historian by trade, I guess I can kind of say that, Rob, and is currently a Emeritus Professor at VUW in Strategic Studies. Rob was a scholar at Duke back in the day, and was at Otago University, where he ran the international office there, and then was Pro-Vice Chancellor International of Victoria University of Wellington. But we're really honoured to have you doing this session for us today, Rob. From my personal experience, I know that you have an enormous amount of knowledge in this area, and we really look forward to hearing from you today. So without further ado, over to you. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thanks, Simon. Morena tato, great to be with you all this morning. Let me just start sharing my screen, and we'll see if that works. And with luck, you all able to see my screen? Yeah. Okay, great. Excellent. Well, as you can see, what I thought we would do this morning is we talk about internationalization of education, but have a conversation about it. So I have a few slides, but they're very skeletal. I don't have a lot of material in the actual PowerPoint presentation, because I hope we could have a pretty interactive session where we discuss various aspects of internationalization and how it might apply, particularly in the school sector in New Zealand. So here's the outline of what I'd like to talk about with you this morning. And as you can see, I want to begin by saying a few words about the context and the importance of context, and add a few caveats about my own experience and role related to internationalization. Then I thought we'd focus very much on the basics of internationalization, so that we spend a little bit of time talking about what exactly it is, and then talk about why internationalize, and reflect a little on the benefits and costs of internationalization. And then as we move into the final part of our discussion, talk about how to internationalize. And I might just make some comments there about some useful guiding principles about successful internationalization. And I'll conclude with some very brief reflections, and see what kind of reflections you all have at the end as well. So let me begin by just saying something about context and those caveats, because as Simon noted, I've been involved in internationalization in the education sector for about 2 decades or so, both at Otago and at Victoria. It means that I've been involved in various internationalization initiatives at those universities, and I'll talk about one of them as an example when we get to the how to internationalize section. But it means I know a reasonable amount about internationalization in that sector. I know a little less about it in the school sector, and context does matter when it comes to internationalization. As we'll see when we talk about the what and the why of internationalization. So please be aware that I'm not an expert in your sector at all. And although I did go through school, like all of you, and one of the schools that is very active in this group, Rongotai College, is where I went when I was a school student here in Wellington. But I know that how you apply internationalization is going to be different in the school sector than it is from the university sector. So that's why I thought we'd make it a conversation where we compare notes, So rather than having me preach and offer a particular model of internationalization, I will talk a little bit about those. And as we go through, bear in mind that point that I've made about context, because I will return to that as we go through the presentation as well. So that's just a few words of introduction there. Is there anything that anyone wants to say or ask right at the beginning? If not, I might just go to my next slide about what is internationalization. And as you can see, I've got the Education New Zealand logo up there. You're all familiar with Education New Zealand, which sits at the heart of the so-called international education industry. And I wanted to, before, what I'd like to do at the beginning is to have you think about what you consider internationalization to be and how you define it. And I thought we could go around and talk about that in terms of your own perspectives on that. But before we do that, so I'm kind of preparing you for that, and you might want to write down your own definition of internationalization. But before we do that, I thought I might just say a few words about that international education paradigm and the international education industry. It's a term, both terms are ones that we use a lot. Interestingly enough, of course, when I was going through school and university, no one ever heard of the term international education, let alone an international education industry. Now, I suspect that you all think that you are part of an international education industry, and Simon and Rachel and I have certainly been part of an international education industry. There are a few paradoxes and ironies about that term and that industry. Because usually when you have an industry, it produces something, and the producers in that industry are pretty conscious of being in that industry. Is there anyone here who doesn't think they're in the international education industry? Just as a question to begin with. Looks like everyone is. So since you're all in the international education industry, can you tell me what its product is? Anyone want to tell me what you're delivering?
A New Zealand education.
A New Zealand educations. Okay. Jessica, is it? No, I've got, sorry.
Yeah, it's Jessica, sorry.
Yeah, it was Jessica.
Yeah.
New Zealand education. Thanks, Jessica. Okay. What else do we have? Everyone agree with that?
Experiences, Rob?
Experiences. What kind of experiences?
Student experience, staff experience, experiences that benefit a whole organization. I think I'm talking from a university perspective here.
Yeah.
But I think that's just a brief explanation here.
Okay. No.
And the chat function.
Gracias. Sorry.
In the chat function, people have put graduates.
Oh, yeah, I was going to look at the chat function. Sorry.
Yeah, selling bums on seats.
Yeah.
Quality education, a global experience, connections.
Okay. Excellent. Graduates. So those are the things we're producing in the international education industry here in this country. Are we producing and teaching physics in our international education industry? People nodding. Global experience as well. Yes, experience of the country. Yes, we are teaching physics. So in the international education industry, most of you are suggesting that the products are graduates, a particular New Zealand inflected education that is delivered, You agree about the physics, presumably. Yeah, we're producing people with an open mind, knowledge and awareness of a wider world. That's what the international education industry is producing. What does a local and a global workforce? What does the domestic education industry produce? Because those are all the things our international education industry produces, you're telling me. What about our domestic education industry? Should be the same thing. Students ready for university, students ready for work. Similar, the same thing. Okay, so if that's the case, interestingly enough, and of course, if you're, who are the, I'll return to that question about the same thing. Who are the actual producers in this industry? We know who the consumers are, presumably, they're students. The producers are schools, education providers, homestay buddies, teachers, international staff. Yeah, teachers are there. If the primary product, the whole school ecosystem, okay, very good. In that case, every math teacher, for example, or science teacher or a history teacher at your school, would they consider themselves to be in the international education industry? When they describe themselves, do they say they're international educators? No, they wouldn't, no. So one of the ironies is that we have an international education industry, not usually, and that's a problem. Yeah, it's one of the ironies that unlike most industries, unlike tourism, various manufacturing industries, farming, farmers pretty much know that what they're doing, who they are. But when we talk about the education industry and throw in that adjective in front of it, international, and when we throw in that other noun, industry, after it, most of the teachers who are the main producers in this so-called industry, I'm not sure they're comfortable with the word industry to begin with. And they don't usually distinguish in terms of any adjectives before education. I think they think of themselves generally as educators who teach their subject to a range of students. And if you think about the New Zealand population and the mix of students that we have in our school sector, what is the difference between a mix of students, some of whom are international and some of whom are domestic, and a mix of students, some of whom are ones who are descended from people who have been here for several hundred years or 50 years, others of whom are descended from people who have been here for about 30 years, but who in some cases may be Chinese, Indian, of European descent. What is the distinction in our school population between international students of different cultures and New Zealand citizens and permanent residents of different cultures? Is there any? Anyone venture any comment on that one? Yeah.
The students that are already here have been socialised, culturalised into the New Zealand way of life, whereas the ones coming from overseas are bringing their culture with them.
And so you suggest that students who are here or born here, in some cases, of course, some of those students are ones who have come relatively recently because you'll have some in your schools who are refugees, for example. We'll have more Afghani children in our schools, not in large numbers, but we'll have a few more soon who will either be permanent residents or citizens, and won't be all that different from an Afghani international student for that matter. So there is, I mean, having
the mixture.
Yeah. So I think it kind of depends. What I'm trying to get at with all these questions about the international education system, international education paradigm, and the international education industry, is that the people who are here in this session. Yeah, thanks for those chat comments, and I'll try and keep on top of the chat, but it's as I'm talking and maneuvering between the chat and talking to you, please bear with me if I miss some of the comments on chat. But what I'm trying to get at is that those of us who have dealt with and thought about international education, which of course is something that has really only been talked about in this country over the last 25 years or so in any meaningful way. And the use of that term international education industry is relatively recent in that sense. The creation of Education New Zealand reflects the fact that you have a government and successive governments who are interested in ensuring a successful international education industry. But there's a certain focus in that paradigm and in the industry that is somewhat different from the focus that most of the educators in the system have about it. And the degree of awareness and the distinctions for people involved in that so-called industry differ considerably. Many of those, as I suggested, who are themselves teachers, would be focused very much only on that noun education and would think a lot less about either industry or international. And in some cases, they might even be critics, particularly of the idea of an industry and commercialization of education. So I just wanted to begin by suggesting and really getting you to think about that question of the paradigm that we operate in amongst the group that is here, and it's a wider group as well, and the more general education paradigm. There are some distinctions between those. And secondly, as a result of those distinctions, is it the case that international education is somewhat different from internationalized education? Or are they the same thing? If they are the same thing, why are they the same thing? If they aren't, how do they differ? And I've got a little cue there, which is a quote that I used in a presentation about 20 years ago from then Minister of Education, Trevor Mallard, who noted that internationalization is not just about money. Interestingly enough, I mentioned the importance of context, in many other international contexts, particularly in Europe, for example, they would say internationalization is not at all about money and shouldn't be. So I wonder if I could just get you, before we get on to your definitions of internationalization, I wonder if any of you want to comment on that question of the distinction between international education and internationalized education. Is there a difference, or are they the same thing? Especially given some of the things you were putting on chat about the kinds of globally oriented citizens that our international education's industry produces.
Different.
Yeah.
One is about international is about going from one country to another to get an education. And internationalization is about widening our curriculum to include a global perspective on different things.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, I think that's a good summation, actually. I don't know if anyone else has any views on that they want to add. I think the idea of difference is there. They are different, but could work together well within a school. Absolutely true. Same for universities. Any other comments? Because if not, we might move on to what are your definitions of internationalization? Anyone else want to comment? I think Leslie's given us hers. Do others have any different dimensions that they want to highlight in their definitions of internationalization? I'd like to comment on screen.
Hi, sorry, my camera's not working, but it's Katrina here.
Okay, Katrina.
So I'm just thinking of Leslie's last comment and thinking if international education is about just going to another country to study, maybe that is really where the money comes in. So that's more where we're thinking about the financial side of things, whereas the internationalization is really thinking about growing the person.
Absolutely. Can you have internationalization without international students?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yep.
I hope so.
You definitely can. Yeah. Global citizens and international capacity building. Thanks, Marlene. Yep. Yep. Any other distinctions or comments from anyone? Yeah, I think it's an important element to begin with in terms of what is internationalization, to realize that distinction between the way that we often treat international education, yes, awareness of the world cultures and geography, yes. Thanks for those as well. The distinction between the way we think of international education industry, the international education paradigm, and internationalization. Often we treat them rather narrowly, tend to focus on international students, tend to focus on the commercial elements of that and the kind of experience, support we give and the selling of that New Zealand education experience. It's not quite the same as internationalization. And yes, internationalization, yes, should relate to both domestic and international students. It should be holistic. And in most of the cases of people who talk about and who write about internationalization, they very much see it in that holistic way. And when I was talking about the kind of diversity that we have within our country, we can have, for instance, in terms of the intercultural dimensions of education, that is easy to occur in our classroom settings without a single so-called international student. Also, it's worth, just before we leave that, it's worth remembering, how do we define an international student in New Zealand? How do you define them in your schools? Fee paying. Thanks, Rachel. At the hard edge of marketing. Well, I think if we think about it, we do, don't we? Yep. Thanks, Linda. Yeah. The difference is, and when we talk about the international education industry, we're talking about the international student fee paying education industry, effectively. And what a student who's not a New Zealand resident or citizen? Yes, classified as a foreign fee payer by the ministry. Exactly. Exactly. Those are international students. We don't define them by the fact that they have a different culture from another group of students within New Zealand. Often we will have international students who are fee paying, who have a much closer cultural affinity to some of our New Zealand citizen and permanent resident students than they do to other international students. So that, for example, a Chinese student from Beijing will have an awful lot in common with many recently immigrated Chinese students who are permanent residents or citizens in the Auckland area, and they'll have much more in common with that student from Beijing, will have much more in common with those students than they will have with a fellow international student, even from another Asian country like Thailand, let alone an international student from Brazil or Germany. But they're all international students, and we use that distinction rather than cultural ones. But I think you've got the sense of that distinction already, and I think we need to bear that in mind as we talk about internationalization. I'm conscious of time, so I will move on to just put up here one definition of internationalization that I've used at the university level, just to give you an idea of a definition. You can come up with your own, and you've got elements that you've already mentioned to me, and you will have thought about them. But I wanted to put up this definition. It's one that applies in the university context. And as I said, context is important. But I wanted to highlight some aspects of it when one thinks about internationalization in an institutional education setting. And you can play with these. And this is one that I used over the years. And it pretty much reflects the approach I've taken to internationalization in the international context, particularly being someone who's had to deal with it at the strategic level and tried to apply it within a university setting. I want to highlight a few words in this definition. The first phrase, at this university, I mentioned context. Internationalization can vary in many ways, and it's a very vague notion in many ways. So it's important to ground it in a distinctive setting and indicate how you, in that distinctive setting, you as members of that particular educational community are going to approach internationalization and apply it. Now, one thing that I've got there is a very important word that's in there, is in the next phrase, conscious. Internationalization has been a feature of education, and some would argue that it is an intrinsic feature of education since education has been institutionalized in human history. That it is, if you think about maths or physics, but most subjects are inherently international and have global implications. So when you are trying to bring out internationalization, it's important to do it consciously so that you highlight what it is about it that you are going to operationalize in your particular institutional setting. I've also got that phrase, institutional embodiment. It means that the whole of the institution is engaged in this enterprise and is aware of it, so that you don't have an international education industry, for example, where most of the so-called producers in that industry aren't aware they're in it. You have people conscious and aware, and you have a sense of what the institution means and wants to do by way of internationalization. And that means choosing between those varied international dimensions, because there are numerous ones. I've got the ones that apply there in the university sector, which refer to research, teaching, learning, and service activities. In the school sector, the research one will not quite apply in the same way, but the teaching and learning and the experience side of it, which many of you deliver, is a very important components. So what does this look like in reality? We'll talk about that as we go through. Very good question. And I'll give you an example of what it means in reality as we go through. The other point that I would make is that when we talk about internationalization, I've mentioned there the staff, students, and related communities. It is not just about one group within within an institution. It's not just about international directors and international students. It needs to be about the range of the actors in that community and their associated communities and stakeholders. And finally, and a very important component, I think that that equation that's hinted at there in that final sentence and the question about what it means in reality is very important. The equation between strategic guidance and organically driven core activities. If you're going to have successful internationalization, it needs direction in order to be conscious and an institutional embodiment of those various international dimensions. But it also needs to reflect organically the core activities of that institution. It needs to reflect the core interests of staff and students, of teachers and students, and of all the other staff in the institution as well. So you need to have some strategic guidance of the direction in which those activities are going to be focused in terms of an internationalization strategy, which we'll come to. Any questions about that? Okay. Okay. Talked a little bit about what internationalization is, and we've kept it pretty vague at the moment, of course, and as I said, it does tend to be somewhat vague, and there are many definitions of it. But why internationalize? What are the most important benefits of internationalization? And what about the costs? So maybe some of you could just speak up or put in chat. What do you think are the most important benefits of internationalization? Anyone want to comment?
Other cultural understanding, understanding between cultures.
Yep, sorry, let me just jump in here. Trying to get the chat. Yes, absolutely. So intercultural understanding, key cultural connections, creating connections. Yeah, connectedness, ability to confidently engage with the world and make a contribution to it. So that, I think what you're talking about is mainly in terms of having students who add rich diversity to a curriculum study, having students who are globally aware, who can be critically conscious global citizens, proving cultural competence, benefits of inclusion, understanding differences, world opportunities. Yep. So you're talking about well-rounded, globally aware students. What about other, sorry, I've got some more. Understanding of other views and what they bring to the world. Yep. What about are there practical benefits? This is all kind of vague feel-good stuff, isn't it? Networks and friendships. Yep. Anything more on the practical side? Building international partners. Business connections. Thanks, Maria. Building international partnerships. Financial gain for the benefit of the school. Alumni.
I think there's the business side and the political side and / diplomacy, those benefits.
Yep. So we're talking about getting students to have a broader, well-rounded sense of the world and its diversity, being able to interact with others from different cultural backgrounds, having a sense of those diverse cultures, And of course, in the case of internationalization that occurs in the setting of a country like New Zealand, you've got certain financial benefits flowing as a result of having international fee-paying students as well. And those two things, I've often argued that those two things are not incompatible with each other, and they shouldn't be incompatible. Europeans tend to take a more critical view of that aspect, but obviously we've got both practical and more general educational benefits that flow from internationalization. Are there any others that we want to? Internationally recognized qualifications, yeah. So what's coming through, I think, is that sense of understanding diversity and being better prepared to operate in diverse contexts. But I think there's one other element that I often mention with internationalization that's very important too, that flows from that engagement with diversity on various levels and that understanding of the world. And that other dimension, Aotearoa sharing its culture, yep. And of course, our students, New Zealand students going elsewhere, being mobile and understanding those other cultures as well, understanding our place in the world. Yeah, two elements there that I want to touch on with respect to some of those comments. And one element that's important to remember in that engagement with diversity, preparing them for higher education, most definitely. One element that I want to highlight is it's very important to remember, alongside diversity, common humanity as well. Because one of the things about internationalization and what we do with whatever kinds of international programs we have is to understand and value the importance of human diversity on various levels. But on the other hand, realizing that the only way that we can understand and appreciate that human diversity is because of various elements of common humanity, which flows through in so many of the subjects that are taught in our schools. So it's that balance between those two, because that common humanity is what enables us ultimately to overcome cultural barriers and to understand each other. Our students are not going to understand hundreds of languages in the world, so they're going to need tools to be able to communicate with each other, but they need an appreciation of the diversity of those languages. So it's important to remember that balance between elements of common humanity, which is critical for internationalization, and elements of diversity, and finding the ways to have concrete programs that highlight both of those elements. The other point I'd make in terms of some of the chat comments we've had and the references to Aotearoa and understanding and showcasing our own culture, I think that in every country where you have schools, universities engaging in various forms of internationalization, when I mention the importance of context, what needs to happen is that internationalization needs to be understood in the context of that distinctive national or local setting. And some of those settings, you can break them down further, deconstruct them, they become very, very diverse. And the whole idea, I teach about nationalism sometimes, the whole idea of nation and nationalism is a contested idea. But what we need to think about when internationalizing is, what is the distinctive element that we bring to it in our particular national and local context, and how does that interact with those broader global dimensions? So that distinctive setting, and how do we use internationalization to get others to have a better appreciation of us, and for us to get a better appreciation of others as well. So those are all important elements. And there's no doubt when one talks about the benefits of internationalization. And if you want to go to that, that link that I have there, that has some arguments about why it's important to internationalize. If you want to build on that in terms of the benefits of internationalization, think about both those very important educational and cultural elements and the practical ones, because of course, I'll get someone to put, maybe, I don't know if Rachel can put that link into the chat for you. If not, I'll try and do that later for you. Yeah, Rachel will arrange to send it later, later for you. But do remember that in terms of those benefits of internationalization, students who are able to benefit from those dimensions of internationalization that we've touched on, undoubtedly are going to be able to have more successful careers. Whether they spend all their lives in this country or go abroad and have internationally mobile careers, they are going to be better equipped to do that in a globalized world. So it's very important in terms of producing the kinds of students who are going to be more successful at university and in their careers as well. So there are plenty of benefits. Just before we move on, what about costs? I don't often mention the costs. And especially when we think in the international education paradigm, other than staffing costs and ensuring that all international directors are well paid, we don't think too much about the costs, do we? Are there costs? Resources, exactly. Yes, marketing. Well, I don't think you need any marketing, in fact, to have an internationalized school necessarily. You do for an international education industry, as we noted, the two aren't quite the same. But if you are going to take internationalization as seriously as we take international education industry marketing, then there will be costs. You will need to resource it. You will need to think about how you're going to consciously internationalize. How are you going to, yeah, exactly, yes. Not all on board, yes. There are also the costs that that you don't necessarily have everyone buying in. And you do need to think about professional development. You do need to think about, if you are going to have international programs, just like whether it's sports or teaching, you need to have people doing them seriously. And you need, as a result, to bring a certain level of resourcing to them. So there will be costs in that sense. It's a matter of how important it is to you and whether you're going to invest in internationalization. And it's an important conversation to have in schools. Now, someone asked about how, and I said I would talk about how to internationalize. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I do think that you do need to think about it in very concrete ways. And as a result of that, I've got a few guiding principles here. And the key one is the one before the bullet points. And this is what I've always thought in the university setting, but I think it applies in all contexts with respect to internationalization. There needs to be a clear strategy. And if you don't have a clear strategy, that conscious element is not going to be there. The institutional buy-in and the sense of it being something that we're all in together in trying to achieve, that sense won't be there. So it's very important to have a clear strategy for investing in internationalization. And that means, first of all, that you need to know why you're doing it. And you need to be able to make that compelling case to others about why you're doing it. And you can have different reasons for doing it. You can do it purely for its intrinsic benefit in terms of that intercultural awareness, for example, about making our students better global citizens, for example. That could be your purpose. It could be that your purpose is about preparing them for more successful global careers. And that's fine as well. You can have both of those, but you need to be clear and be able to persuade others in your institution about why you need to internationalize in particular ways. You also need to be aware that just like IT, internationalization is not an end in itself. It's because of those outcomes that we have in terms of the kinds of differences that internationalization makes for students and for teachers and for others in the institution. And it's what it delivers rather than what it is that ultimately is most important. Also, especially when I mention costs and resources and investing in internationalization, it can't just be a marketing add-on. You tell when you're trying to get international students in your school, you tell them, oh yes, we have a very diverse international student population, and we place a great deal of emphasis on them being globally aware, interculturally competent kinds of students. But you don't have anything that you particularly do to achieve that. No, it needs to be an integral part of your core institutional activities and not something that you just highlight for marketing ends. One of the great things about internationalization, though, is that, of course, you're competing with others to attract international students. But when you're internationalizing, you're not really competing with others. You're much more likely to be able to cooperate across a whole sector and with neighboring schools without difficulty. And you can have complementary approaches, but they don't need to be competing at all. Internationalization is wonderful in that respect. It is much more amenable to cooperation between institutions and not just in a particular sector. There is no reason why tertiary and secondary institutions cannot cooperate in internationalization activities and do it in complementary ways where they each build on each other. And a point that I made earlier is that, of course, if you're going to think seriously about the context in which you're internationalizing, then your internationalization should reflect your national, local, and institutional distinctiveness, so that while you're getting students to think globally, while you're thinking globally, you're acting locally, and you're bringing out both those diverse dimensions of internationalization and the common humanity as well. Also, it's not much use if you're going to engage in international programs to have them just for one class, for one year. It's important to have them as a whole of institutional enterprise. So you don't have the situation where you have teachers in your schools who have no awareness of an international education industry. Everyone in the institution needs to be aware of what you're trying to do if you are embarking on an internationalization program. And you do need to be upfront about the fact that if this is something important to your school, then you need a principal to resource it. You need to recognize that it costs, just like marketing costs in order to attract international students. So if you're going to produce internationally aware students for all your classrooms, for your whole school, if you're going to ensure that the students in your school have an appreciation of the diverse cultural backgrounds that they have, then you're going to have to think seriously about it. And if you're going to think seriously about it, you need to resource it properly. Any questions about those guiding principles? No? Okay. I've got here something that I stole from the internet, but which gives you an idea. If you are going to come up with an internationalization strategy, these are some of the elements that you will need to bear in mind as you devise and implement that strategy. That you begin with a strategy, and in beginning with that strategy, you as international directors, for example, you're not going to be able to do it alone. You are going to have senior buy-in from your senior leadership. You're going to have engagement with all the teachers, with students, and with the school board and parents and so forth in developing that strategy. But once you have a strategy that does reflect that buy-in and that reflects your distinctive context, then you need to bear in mind those different, not all of them will apply to the school sector, but you need to bear in mind those kinds of elements as you go through trying to create those globally competent graduates. And remember those points. And again, you'll be able to have this PowerPoint later to look at it and note some of the points there, that resources follow strategy. The strategy is what drives how you address those different dimensions and how you are going to use student diversity, for example, number 5, as an empowering element of what happens at your school. What you're going to do in terms of international students' experiences, how you're going to support your students in their internationalization, something that you do for international fee-paying students and something that should be done for all students if you're taking internationalization seriously. Number 8, how you're going to use your strategy in a way that enables you to get more leverage from the kinds of partnerships that you have with international schools, the kind of international partnerships you have with schools internationally, as many of you do have. So that's something that you might look at as a little bit of a guide. Now, again, someone asked about concrete ways of internationalizing. One example that I want to, that some of you may be aware of, is an initiative that I developed, because when I was thinking about, I developed an internationalization strategy for Victoria in about 2008 or so, which guided internationalization at Victoria for a number of years. And in developing that strategy, I thought, what can we do? I thought of various kinds of programs that we might pursue, and it included student exchange programs, broadening those. It included having an element of offshore delivery as well, various things that were commercially oriented. Those are plenty. But I thought, what can we do on a university-wide scale that would touch a lot of our students and serve as a flagship internationalization initiative? And what I developed, again, that's why I mentioned complementarity and cooperation. I stole the idea from Macquarie University, who had a global leadership program, after hearing a presentation about theirs. And from 2008, we developed an international leadership program at the university. And if you go to that link, you can find out something about it. But that program was open to all Victoria students. Since it was launched, it's still going. It's had thousands of students participate in it. It uses academics to give presentations to students. It brings in diplomats because of Wellington's capital city setting. It tries to take advantage of the distinctiveness of that setting to bring in diplomats to talk to students in a diplomatic dialogue series. And that program consists of a combination of experiential activities, of seminars, and of lectures and presentations as well. And students have to complete a certain number in order to get a certificate. And I used it essentially, as I said, as a framework on the slide, as a framework for multiple forms of international engagement. And that's one of the things you need to think about when you internationalize. What kinds of programs can you develop that serve multiple ends? Now, this international leadership program has served as a framework. By having diplomats come in, it means that the university engages with that particular community in a way that it's more difficult for others to do. It highlights its capital city setting. It's also a program that you can use for marketing purposes. American study abroad providers love the fact that Victoria University has this program. And when you market the university to those fee-paying students, it's an additional bonus. So it also means that every single and it's free to all students. Every single Victoria University student has the chance to participate in something that broadens their international horizons. And it did need resourcing. It did need strategic support from the highest level, from the Vice Chancellor. And as part of that resourcing, it was also used as a way of multiplying, having a multiplier effect with various other things that we were trying to achieve. So we were trying to increase the number of students who went on student exchange. And what we did was if they participated in the International Leadership Program, we created a series of grants. And if they did enough of the program, they would get more money to go on student exchange. It meant that we could simultaneously increase the number of students going on student exchange while ensuring that they also participated in this program, which helped them indeed become better rounded global citizens. So what you need to think about is what kind of programs can you develop that are appropriate for your setting, which deliver multiple forms of international engagement and can serve as a platform that you can use for all sorts of other things. And in the case of Victoria, I know that when I was Pro-Vice Chancellor International, anytime I met with an ambassador, I immediately mentioned it and said, you know, you can come on campus. And of course, they love it as well. And it means that you're able to engage. We had partnerships with various other groupings like VSA, Volunteer Service Abroad, the Asia New Zealand Foundation. It served as a form of stakeholder engagement for Victoria, as well as a form of internationalization for the student community. And you need to think about what sort of comparable things can you do which are appropriate to your particular setting. And some schools have done this. Simon launched a similar program at Hutt Valley High School, for example. So that's one example. Any questions about that? Okay. Now, I know that I think we've pretty much reached the end of the hour that we wanted to spend on this issue. And I would just make a couple of final closing comments and see if you have any closing reflections as well. The two important things to remember, I think, are summarized in these bullet points. That internationalization, as I said, it can be very vague, but that's a benefit as well. It means it is what we make it. And we can make it something wonderful, something that is empowering for the whole school community. And how do you measure success is a good question. I'll return to that. And that also, that context is critical and purpose even more so. That you need to think about, why do you want to internationalize it? What in your role can you do to engage with others from the principal on down to pursue a particular internationalization path, and how can you make it appropriate in your particular context? Success, how do you measure success, is a very good question. I once gave a presentation at the European International Education Association, which I called Dimmi Quando, because a big question is, how do we know when we're internationalized? And the answer comes back to those bullet points that I have there. You will know it in your context and in relation to your purpose, so that when you develop your particular strategy, you need to have goals that you build into it, that you can measure. And so in the case of the international strategy, internationalization strategy that we had at Victoria University of Wellington, for example, there were goals for increasing the numbers of students and student mobility. Goals for the, exactly, it is very similar to what you might do for a global citizenship program. Goals about the number of students you want to be engaged in a particular activities. You can quantify it in various ways, depending on what you've made your targets. So success will be defined in large part in relation to your purpose and your context. Some of that can be quantitative and can be measured so that you know if you're not getting the numbers of students that you want in your program, maybe it's because your principal has not allowed you to invest enough resources into it, for example. You may have other sorts of goals that you put in the program, but it's critical to have goals and to think, no problem, Virginia. It's critical to have those goals and to think about what are going to be the appropriate measures for your success with respect to how you've chosen to internationalize in the context of your school and in the context of your school possibly working with other schools or other international partners or domestic partners for that matter. Any other comments or questions?
Thank you, Rob. I just wanted to say briefly, I think, increasing or the need to increase the understanding and appreciation of the value of internationalization is probably more important now than ever. And the information you presented and thought leadership, I think, is crucial. So thank you for these and for all of those of you who organized this talk. It's been very refreshing and so really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Babel, gracias. And I think the point you made about thought leadership with respect to internationalization is a very important one, because it's critical to be able, and coming back to that point I made about strategically driven, but reflective of organic developments in your own institution. It's critical that you have broad buy-in so that you have the ability to have senior leadership supporting the strategic direction of what you're doing, but that it's not simply the senior leadership and you that are doing it, that it has that much broader buy-in across the whole community of your particular institution. Both dimensions, the senior strategic direction that comes through the thought leadership provided by particular groups within the institution, and the broader engagement with the whole of that community and beyond is critical. Happy to take any other comments or questions. And if not, I might hand over to Rachel and Simon.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's been a really interesting session for people, even though it's only been about an hour long. We've packed a lot into that. And I mean, I think right from the get-go, and mentioning the context and sort of about internationalization and, is it international education or is it internationalized education? And the strategic balance with your activities, etc. I really like the fact, I mean, if one big takeaway from people, I suppose, is the idea about it's about everyone engaging in the same process, from the principal down. And I guess some people would put the question out there, what about the Ministry of Education in there as a part of that? Where's that? And I'd say a lot of people in secondary schools would say that the Ministry of Education is behind the 8 ball on that thing. So I guess it does come down to your individual institution. And that part of that global process and how it should be holistic. I like the the idea of strategic guidance balanced with your core activities. That's at the heart of it right there, and I think that's really, really awesome. And the teaching and learning experiences, all the stakeholders, and even I like the way you paired it back to the really basic level of this is understanding the value and importance of human diversity and humanity, which is sort of right at the core of that whole process. So I think it's been a really great session, Rob. Thanks so much. We'll be putting the video up so people can go back through and look at that. Obviously, for a lot of people, undertaking the idea of sort of internationalizing your program at a school, I think from today's session realizes a lot more to it than just, as Rob mentioned, you can't just use internationalization as a marketing tool. It has to be top to bottom. You have to sort of walk the talk, as it were. And I think obviously that gets getting buy-in, which in a school is difficult. You'll have some teachers that will be very interested in internationalization and within the work that they do, but most probably won't. And so that's a tough nut. And from my own experience at Hutt Valley High School, kind of dragging the international program from way out on the periphery and trying to make that more of a core activity was quite a tough cookie. But we did manage to do that through certain internationalization programs. So it's all about setting your objectives, I suppose. But on behalf of all of us, Rob, I'd like to thank you very much again for presenting today. It's been really, really great. We'll be putting the information up on YouTube, the recording of this on YouTube. So, and again, if people have any questions, you can go to the Facebook page and contact us there. So once again, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're most welcome, Simon, everyone, and thanks for your participation and excellent comments. Just on the Ministry and Education New Zealand, for that matter, there's no both the Ministry and Education New Zealand have an interest in internationalisation. In the case of Education New Zealand, they're taking it much more seriously of late. In part, I think, because of current circumstances. So some of you may have been engaged with them on that front, and there's plenty of scope to engage with both them and the Ministry more extensively in terms of internationalisation, and seek out support for them. Go ahead and hassle them about it and see what kind of support you can get and ideas you can get from them about internationalisation as well. But let me wish you all luck with your internationalisation activities, and thanks to Simon and Rachel and everyone else who made this session possible. I'm easily contactable through Victoria University website. I have a VUW email address. Happy to answer questions by email if you want to contact me directly. Okay, great to see you all.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, everyone.